Alexei Nikolaevich Kosygin was an odd man out among the Soviet leadership. By the time Brezhnev came to power, he had already become a living legend, the director of the Soviet Union, a man forged in the crucible of Stalinist industrialization. He had risen through all the ranks of the system, but he survived not through intrigue, but through phenomenal, almost computer-like efficiency. To understand the depth of the drama that unfolded in the 1960s, one must realize the scale of this figure. He was not just a bureaucrat, he was the architect of Soviet industry's survival, that rare type of leader who could see not only the numbers in reports, but also the real workshops, the people of the machines, the trains carrying raw materials and finished products. His authority was absolute and unquestionable, based not on intrigue or party demagoguery, but on his phenomenal, almost superhuman capacity for work and competence. For those who worked with him, this was expressed in simple but telling details. He could name the planned indicators of any large enterprise without a piece of paper, and immediately point out where the problem was buried in the supply chain. Back in 1941, when the foundations of the Soviet state were crumbling under the blows of the Wehrmacht, it was Kosygin who became the force that prevented the economy from collapsing. At a time when many party officials were losing their heads in panic, he calmly solved problems of biblical proportions. Unlike orators accustomed to persuading their audience with slogans, he persuaded with figures, graphs, and well-thought-out decisions that yielded results tomorrow rather than in some abstract, bright future. Stalin, who had an animal instinct for useful people, called him an arithmetic machine for his phenomenal memory for numbers. But that was an understatement. Behind this nickname lay respect for a man who could combine strategic vision and pedantic precision of calculation in a single conversation. Kosygin was a crisis manager of the highest order long before the term came into use. He oversaw the evacuation of industry, paved the road of life in besieged Leningrad, and was responsible for the country's currency reserves. These functions required not only organizational talent, but also rare psychological stability. He had to talk simultaneously with the military, party leaders, engineers, and diplomats, while keeping the big picture in mind. He went through the mill of Stalin's purges, survived the Leningrad affair, when his comrades were shot in droves, and preserved himself as a professional. This survival was not the result of blind luck. He knew how to be so useful to the system that destroying him would have meant shooting oneself in the foot. In the eyes of the economic elite of the USSR, factory directors and ministers, he was an unquestionable authority. He knew how every cog in the huge machine of the Soviet economy worked, because he had personally tightened many of those cogs, sometimes literally living in factories and on business trips where the working day began at dawn and ended well after midnight. By the early 1960s, Kosygin represented a unique type of Soviet leader, a technocrat to the core, a pragmatist devoid of ideological trappings. For him, talk of 5-year plans and the victory of communism was not a reason for grandiloquent speeches, but a dry planning task to be accomplished with minimal losses. His silence was mistaken for severity, his restraint for arrogance. In reality, behind this lay the inner discipline of a man who was accustomed to being accountable not for impressive reports, but for industries that actually worked. But this man was the only one in the upper echelons of power who truly understood what needed to be done with the economy. And it was this enormous authority that made him dangerous to those who were used to running the country with slogans and kisses. There was an unspoken rule among party apparatchiks. A leader who was too smart and too independent was always a potential threat. But in 1964, this titan faced a new reality, where professionalism began to lose out to clan loyalty. After Khrushchev's removal in 1964, power was divided among three people. Brezhnev became party leader, Podgorny became formal president, and Kosygin became head of government. It seemed like the perfect balance. The party dealt with ideology, and the professionals dealt with the economy. But Brezhnev, who was initially considered a temporary figure, proved to be more cunning. He was annoyed that the real levers of control over the giant country, finances, factories, resources, were in Kosygin's hands, not his. What historians would call a quiet war between the two cabinets began. Where it would have been possible to agree on a rational division of functions, a struggle began for symbolic primacy. Who would be the first to sign? Who would be the first to announce the decision on television? Who would be perceived by society as the true ruler of the country? Brezhnev methodically sought to secure an office for himself in the Kremlin, in the Council of Ministers building, in order to symbolically cement his status as first among equals. He covered every step in this direction with references to convenience and the need for operational cooperation, but the essence was simple. Physical proximity to the government was supposed to emphasize his supremacy. This was a direct invasion of Kosygin's territory and caused the Prime Minister ill-concealed irritation. For a man accustomed to a clear division of powers, the appearance of the party leader in the executive branch seemed like a violation of the unspoken, contractual field. In the Soviet hierarchy, the location of an office meant more than an official title. The Kremlin was a symbol of state power. The party's central committee was located on Staraya Square, but Brezhnev needed to be physically present where government decisions were made. He wanted to show, "I am the boss here, not Kosygin." It was a struggle not only for documents, but also for corridors, for the routes taken by ministers, for whose door they would knock on first. But the main problem was authority. Brezhnev felt insecure against the backdrop of Kosygin. Why? Because the ministers, seasoned, experienced economic heavyweights, understood who was who. They knew how to distinguish between a person who understood the essence of the matter and a politician who lived on rumors and memos. When a difficult question arose about the construction of a factory, the distribution of funds, or the purchase of grain, they went to Kosygin. Brezhnev was clueless about these issues. His confidence instantly melted away as soon as the conversation moved from general phrases to specific coefficients and indicators. It reached the point of absurdity. Ministers who had agreed on important issues with Kosygin and begun to implement them were suddenly reprimanded by Brezhnev. The General Secretary would summon them to his office and throw a tantrum, not because the decision was wrong, but because it had been made without him. "Why didn't you report it? Who gave you permission?" Brezhnev would shout, trying to compensate for his incompetence with administrative pressure. These scenes clearly revealed the nervousness of a man who felt that his power was based not on knowledge of the matter at hand, but on his position and the fear of his subordinates. Ministers found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Either carry out Kosygin's professionally competent order and get a dressing down from the General Secretary, or bow down to Brezhnev and ruin the case. The result was paralyzing caution, with every manager thinking not about the correctness of a decision, but about who to report to and in what order so as not to incur wrath. Brezhnev began to actively interfere in economic issues he did not understand, simply to demonstrate his influence. He could overturn a decision by the Council of Ministers on land reclamation or the construction of a hydroelectric power station, guided by the advice of his amateurish associates. Kosygin, accustomed to clear subordination and logic, was enraged by such amateurism. But Brezhnev saw this as a strengthening of his power. He created a system in which personal loyalty to the General Secretary was valued above professionalism. It was classic jealousy of a weak leader towards a strong deputy, only on the scale of a superpower. Any initiative that did not originate from him and was not agreed upon with his entourage was perceived as an encroachment on his monopoly. Realizing that a direct attack on the chief administrator was impossible due to his enormous authority, Brezhnev chose the tactic of a boa constrictor and started a war of the apparatuses. Brezhnev could not dismiss Kosygin. It would have caused shock in the economy and misunderstanding in the world. Kosygin was the face of Soviet stability in the West and a guarantor of efficiency within the country. His speeches at international negotiations and his reputation as a rational partner made him indispensable in the eyes of external players. Therefore, the General Secretary chose a Jesuit strategy: leave the figure untouched, but remove all the pawns and figures defending it. It was an operation to isolate the Prime Minister, a tactic of slow suffocation. Outwardly, the appearance of trust was maintained, but his real authority was gradually being undermined. Kosygin was not alone in the Politburo. He was supported by such powerful figures as Kirill Mazurov, first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, and Gennady Voronov, chairman of the Council of Ministers of the RSFSR. They openly expressed their disagreement with Brezhnev, which was intolerable to the General Secretary. In a system where unity of views had become a mandatory ritual, any disagreement from a high-ranking official was perceived as the beginning of potential opposition. At the same time, the Central Committee apparatus began methodically infiltrating its people into the structures of the Council of Ministers, essentially creating a parallel government. These people formally reported to the Prime Minister, but in reality, they followed signals from Staraya Square. Brezhnev began to take out Kosygin's allies one by one. The most striking example was the fate of Kirill Mazurov. He was a strong manager, a loyal ally of Kosygin, a man who could speak directly to Brezhnev about the failures of the party's economic leadership. The result? He was dismissed for health reasons, a classic phrase for political assassination in the USSR. Voronov suffered the same fate. With the loss of these figures, Kosygin lost not just colleagues, but people who were ready to support his reform agenda when needed. The struggle was not only at the personal level, but also at the structural level. Brezhnev inflated the staff of the Central Committee, creating departments that duplicated the ministries. The Central Committee's Heavy Industry Department began to command the Ministry of Heavy Industry. Central Committee instructors, who often had no real production experience, dictated terms to ministers. This created monstrous bureaucracy and chaos. A decision that previously went through one instance now went through two or three, and personal interests left their mark at each level. Kosygin tried to fight back, arguing that the introduction of party control into operational management killed initiative and responsibility. But the forces were unequal. Where he appealed to logic and figures, his opponents appealed to slogans and fears of weakening the role of the party. Kosygin was stripped of his powers. First, his like-minded colleagues in the Politburo were removed. Then his deputies began to be replaced by people personally loyal to Brezhnev, such as Tikhonov. The Prime Minister found himself in a vacuum. At Politburo meetings, his voice grew quieter and quieter, drowned out by a chorus of sycophants praising the wisdom of the General Secretary. Where his opinion had previously been listened to as the final word, now his remarks were politely heard and set aside for further study. This was not just the defeat of one man, it was the defeat of common sense. The system rejected professionals, replacing them with loyal executors. In the long run, this meant that any complex tasks would be solved according to the principle of, as they say from above, rather than according to the principle of efficiency. By the early 1970s, Kosygin found himself a general without an army, and the disagreements had reached a new level. It was no longer about offices, but about the fate of the USSR's most famous economic reform. The situation that had developed was a prologue to a global strategic divergence that finally divided the party and economic elites on opposite sides of the barricades. It was no longer just a question of management methods, but of a fundamental choice of the path of development for the entire Soviet civilization. The question was stark: continue to live by inertia, relying on the expansion of old models, or try to rebuild the economic mechanism while it was still manageable. By the early 1970s, two fundamentally different philosophies, two views of the country's future, had formed in the highest echelons of power in the USSR. On one side was a group of technocrats led by Alexei Kosygin. It included such prominent figures as Kirill Mazurov, as well as representatives of the younger generation of managers, Central Committee Secretary Vladimir Dolgich and Konstantin Katushev. Their position was extremely pragmatic. The Soviet economy, in its current form, had exhausted its potential for extensive growth. Kosygin and his like-minded colleagues insisted that simply building new factories was no longer enough. It was necessary to radically change the very structure of the economy. Behind the dry term intensification lay an attempt to make the system more flexible, sensitive to demand, and capable of responding not only to instructions from above, but also to real needs. The essence of the dispute was the choice between a sedative for society and a medicine that was bitter but necessary. Kosygin's group advocated intensifying production. They proposed giving enterprises real rather than paper autonomy, introducing full cost accounting, and focusing not on output, gross production indicators, but on profit and product quality. Many historians believe that Kosygin was groping for a model that would later make China famous, maintaining strong political power while introducing elements of the market and personal interest of enterprises in profit. It was a difficult path, requiring retraining of personnel and breaking habitual patterns, but it led to the creation of a modern, competitive power. For many nomenclature workers, this prospect was frightening. They had to give up their usual methods of extracting resources and learn to live by the rules of efficiency. However, this vision was opposed by a powerful coalition of conservatives rallied around Leonid Brezhnev. For them, the main priority was not economic efficiency, but political stability and the peace of mind of the nomenclature. Their reasoning was simple. It was better to preserve the current order with its familiar shortcomings than to take risks and launch processes whose outcome was difficult to predict. And then, geology itself intervened in the dispute, playing into the hands of Brezhnev's guard. The discovery of colossal oil reserves in Western Siberia and the ensuing global energy crisis of 1973, which drove up the price of black gold, became a fateful gift of fortune for the USSR. The system, which was already creaking under internal tension, suddenly received a powerful boost from outside. A tempting alternative to reform appeared. Why bother modernizing machinery, risking social stability, and retraining managers when you could simply sell oil and buy everything you needed from the West? Brezhnev and his entourage chose the path of least resistance. This was the beginning of the formation of the very oil needle on which the Soviet and then Russian economies became chronically dependent. Revenues from petrodollars made it possible to preserve an inefficient system, fill store shelves with imported goods, and put off pressing problems indefinitely. At first glance, it looked like a triumph. Foreign trade indicators were growing, consumption was improving, and the illusion of sustainable prosperity was created. Kosygin fiercely resisted this approach. He argued that squandering natural resources was a dead end, that easy money corrupted the administrative apparatus and killed the incentive to develop domestic technologies. Behind the scenes, he told his colleagues, "We are squandering our children's future." But his arguments were met with Brezhnev's complacency. Why reform when the country was already in a golden age? Vladimir Dolgich and Konstantin Katushev, who tried to support technological renewal, also encountered fierce resistance from party orthodoxy. Any attempt to talk about the need to cut inefficient projects was perceived as an attack on established interests. The victory of the oil lobby marked the beginning of an era of stagnation. External prosperity concealed internal decay, and professionalism finally gave way to loyalty. But the final break did not come about because of the economy, but because of a fateful foreign policy decision. While economic differences could still be attributed to working issues, the events of December 1979 drew an insurmountable moral line between Kosygin and Brezhnev's entourage. The question of sending Soviet troops into Afghanistan was the final act in the Prime Minister's drama. By this point, Kosygin was practically isolated, but his voice still carried weight, and he used that weight to try to prevent disaster. For him, this was not just another item on the agenda, but a moral choice made by a man who had seen war not in newsreels, but from within the state apparatus. The decision to invade was made by a small circle that included Yuri Andropov, KGB, Dmitry Ustinov, Ministry of Defense, and Andrei Gromyko, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the so-called small group of the Politburo. Leonid Brezhnev, whose health had deteriorated significantly by that time, was effectively under their influence. He was no longer able to fully control the flow of information and depended on how reports were packaged for him. Alexei Kosygin was the only member of the Politburo who categorically and openly opposed this move. This was not just a political calculation. It was the position of a man who had gone through the Great Patriotic War in one of the most responsible positions. For him, any decision about war automatically meant the question, how many people will we lose, and for what? As the former head of the Evacuation Council, Kosygin knew the ins and outs of war better than any ideologue. He understood that a military campaign in a mountainous Islamic country where there was no clear front line would result not only in colossal economic costs that would devastate an already weak budget, but also in senseless casualties. At meetings where the Afghan question was discussed, Kosygin came into direct conflict with the powerful triumvirate of Andropov, Ustinov, and Gromyko. He warned of international isolation, of sanctions that would cut off access to technology, which is what happened, and that the USSR would be drawn into a conflict from which there would be no way out. His words did not sound fearful, but rather like the sober calculation of a man accustomed to thinking years ahead, rather than just until the next report. His refusal to sign the final resolution on the introduction of troops was an unprecedented move for the Soviet system, where unanimous approval was a ritual. Kosygin refused to sign a document that he considered a criminal mistake. This provoked the fury of Andropov and Ustinov. They perceived the Prime Minister's pacifism not as wisdom, but as senile weakness and disloyalty to the general line. For people accustomed to discipline as unconditional obedience, the very fact of refusal was tantamount to rebellion. From that moment on, Kosygin ceased to be simply an inconvenient prime minister. He became an enemy within the system. Brezhnev's entourage finally came to the conclusion that Kosygin was in the way. His arguments that socialism should be defended with economic success rather than tanks in foreign mountains sounded like sedition to the aging leaders. This principled refusal cost Kosygin what little influence he had left. After December 1979, he was effectively no longer invited to informal meetings of the inner circle, where real decisions were made. The Prime Minister of a great power found himself in an information vacuum, watching as his worst predictions began to come true. The West imposed sanctions, the 1980 Olympics were boycotted, and the first zinc coffins were sent to Afghanistan. Each such coffin was a silent confirmation of his correctness and, at the same time, a blow to his soul. After this démarche, Kosygin's days as Prime Minister were numbered, and his place was already being divided among new favorites. The end of Alexei Kosygin's career was tragic and indicative of that era. The system he tried to modernize mercilessly chewed him up and spat him out. By 1980, the health of the chief engineer of the USSR had been undermined by constant stress and the struggle against the windmills of party bureaucracy. For years, he lived in a state of constant internal mobilization, when every morning began with a stack of documents and ended with the feeling that once again he had been prevented from completing a single serious undertaking. After a series of mini-strokes and a severe heart attack, Kosygin ended up in hospital, which was a signal for his opponents to attack. In such a system, illness was perceived not as a human tragedy, but as a convenient political opportunity. The main beneficiaries of Kosygin's downfall were Nikolai Tikhonov and Andrei Kirilenko. Tikhonov, a member of Brezhnev's Dnipropetrovsk clan, had long had his sights set on the prime minister's seat. He was content with the role of a diligent executor who did not claim to have an independent line. Kirilenko, who oversaw the party's organizational work, provided administrative support for the removal of the unpopular head of government. While Kosygin was lying under IV drips, active preparations for his replacement were underway in the corridors of power. His deputies were summoned to the Central Committee and given an unambiguous message. They now had to orient themselves towards Tikhonov. Loyalty slowly but surely shifted to the new figure. In October 1980, after suffering another heart attack, Alexei Nikolaevich wrote a letter of resignation. He understood that his time was up. Legend has it that he tried to leave his colleagues a political testament calling for a renewal of personnel, but the system simply deleted it. The resignation was accepted dryly, without discussion. The 75-year-old Nikolai Tikhonov was immediately appointed to replace him, a man who was only a pale shadow of his predecessor, but who completely satisfied Brezhnev with his obedience. Thus, the apparatus instinctively chose not the one who could lead the country out of the impasse, but the one who guaranteed no change. Alexei Kosygin died just 2 months after his resignation on the 18th of December, 1980. Even his departure became a hostage to Brezhnev's vanity. The fact is that the next day, the 19th of December, Leonid Ilyich celebrated his birthday. The party leadership decided not to spoil the General Secretary's mood. The news of the death of the man who had carried the economy of the superpower on his shoulders for 16 years was withheld. The country learned of the former Prime Minister's death with a shameful delay, when the Kremlin had finished eating the birthday cake. The funeral was modest, with the urn containing his ashes walled up in the Kremlin wall. But this silence was the final insult to a professional from a system that was sinking into falsehood. Kosygin's departure was a point of no return for the Soviet Union. Alexei Kosygin left, warning of problems, but no one wanted to listen to him. History remembers this refusal as one of the most costly mistakes of the Soviet Union. Today, decades after the collapse of the USSR, the figure of Alexei Nikolaevich Kosygin is perceived quite differently from the figures of other leaders of that era. Against the backdrop of the eccentric Khrushchev, Brezhnev laden with orders, and the stern Andropov, Kosygin remained in the shadows for a long time. He was called a dry prime minister and criticized for his lack of charisma and excessive arithmetic. But time has put everything in its place. In an era when society was tired of bright but empty promises, calm competence suddenly came to be perceived as the highest virtue. It is now becoming clear that it was precisely this dry professionalism that was so lacking in the late USSR. Kosygin has gone down in history as a symbol of a missed alternative, a path of evolutionary development without revolutions and upheavals. He was perhaps the only person in the top leadership who understood how the giant machine of the Soviet economy actually worked and knew how to fix it. He was respected even by ideological opponents in the West, who called him the most competent negotiator and manager behind the Iron Curtain. For them, he was a rare representative of the system with whom it was possible to talk in terms of numbers rather than slogans. Today, Kosygin is remembered not for his loud slogans, which he disliked, but for his concrete achievements. The factories built under his leadership, the cities that grew in Siberia, and the stability that he ensured not only with oil, but also with labor. This is a monument to a man who tried to combine socialist ideals with economic logic, and whose personal tragedy foreshadowed the tragedy of a huge country. That's all for now. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up.